You're watching BCTV, Branford's community access station.
This is BCTV, Branford Government Television, a service of Branford Community Television. The following program is brought to you through the support of the Town of Branford.
I don't know most of the people.
Yeah.
So, well,
Kathy's coming. She's gonna be late. I haven't heard of it.
There she is. Speak of the devil. I was talking behind your back. So, it was all good, though.
That's okay.
Okay, since I can see myself on the screen, that means we can start the meeting. I'd like to call to order the February 22nd meeting of the Steering Committee for the Plan of Conservation and Development. And I think our first order of business is to have a motion to approve the last meeting's minutes. That was from February 7th.
So moved?
Second. Any comments, changes? We're good? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. We're going to... Let's see. We're going to talk about just a couple of minutes about future scheduling, I guess. Glenn, do you want to... Or Harry, you want to address that?
Okay, I'll just jump in. You probably have a draft revision list of meeting dates in your packets. Sorry about goes back a couple of months, and we were going to have this meeting later in the evening. And this will not be a regular meeting anyway, so it was too late to get that on the schedule. Right now, we've got several meetings starting March 14th, April 11th, May 9th, June 13th, July 11th, August 8th, and September 12th. May not need all of these, it's my understanding, but at this point, they're all listed as regular meetings. And we have them down in the basement conference room where we were meeting before. That seemed to be marginally workable. I really haven't come up with a better venue. It's very difficult to get this room or to get Canoe Brook. We got sort of a special permission to have the listening sessions a little bit earlier at 4:30, but otherwise you can't start until about 5 o'clock to have the meeting. So I can try and explore using that if you'd like, or we can go back to the basement conference room as a default and see how that goes. And if it's a problem, I can figure out where to go from there. I don't know what your thoughts are as a group.
We're still planning 2-hour meetings, is that the plan?
Right.
Okay. How does everybody feel about just keeping the set of dates we already have? I mean, is there any reason to change it?
I think the dates are okay.
Yeah, I mean, as we go along, we can decide if we need to skip one in the middle of summer or keep them all.
Okay.
So,
And I remember we did talk about the time, I think, before we moved to Canoe Brook. And we had been starting at 4, and I think in deference to some folks who wanted to make it from work, that may be members of the public, moved it to 4:30 just to move that window a little bit later, knowing that we were having this public comment period kind of at the end of the meeting and people could leave work and make that. So does this time still work? It seemed to be kind of convenient for people at the end of the day and then go home.
yeah, it's okay.
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 So we will let it stand the way it is and take it up if we need to make any changes later. We can send something out to notify the public somehow that we'll put it on the website and so forth, that it will be down in the basement conference room. The next meeting will be March 14th, and that will start at 4:30 to 6:30 p.m.
Okay, sounds like a plan. Glenn, do you want to,
Did you want to do the minutes, Phil?
We did the
Oh, we did the minutes?
You second.
you
Oh, I
second
did,
it?
okay, sorry, I was looking at something else.
You're the president now.
It's been a long night.
I think the purpose of today's meeting is to give the committee an opportunity to start to filter back through the booklets, to identify issues which you think need some additional discussion. You may recall, as we went through the booklets the first times, there were some issues which came up, which we said, well, let's mark that one for further discussion later. Hopefully in your packet, you received a memorandum from me, which identifies in sort of the different booklets some of the issues that I thought, based on our conversations, we might want to talk about, and specifically the topics that were raised for highlighted discussion are highlighted here in red and yellow. So I think the purpose of tonight's meeting is to give the committee the opportunity to go back through these issues and topics and give us additional thought and guidance on these, so that when it comes time to putting the plan together, we reflect your thoughts and ideas. So page 1 of the memo is simply just an overview or introduction, if you will, to the memo. Page 2 summarizes the conservation-related booklets. There were 3 highlighted questions in here. You want to jump right to number 3?
Do we need to, I mean, will we be going through each one of these eventually, or your thoughts are just to hit the
I think-
highlighted ones for now?
For me, to be able to craft a plan effectively for you and for Branford, I need to get thoughts or feedback on this. The issue, for example, under topic number 1, related to flooding, and certainly with the issues of increasing storm severity that we're having, people are finding themselves in situations where they're living in neighborhoods that are flooding and will likely flood in the future. FEMA is not ahead of the curve in terms of identifying floodplain areas. FEMA is essentially a flood insurance program. If you are in a defined floodplain, you pretty much are required to buy it by a mortgager. If you don't have a mortgage, then you don't have to get it. But if you flood, you're not eligible for any federal relief, aid, et cetera. It's an insurance policy. The problem that we can sometimes have with floodplains is the floodplains are defined based on historic flooding and what they think may happen in the next year or couple of years, but the maps are only updated, or they're updated infrequently. So some communities have adopted standards and said, rather than just force people to build at the flood elevation, they add in what's called a foot of freeboard. It's just a little extra insurance to help property owners avoid issues or damage. Some homeowners don't like that, because an additional foot of elevation means you got to build an additional foot, and they're mad about it because that's dollars to them today. But from a community-wide perspective, if we think about it sort of over the longer term, we may be actually saving people a lot of grief down the road. So some communities say, understand that, we'd like to follow the FEMA program, it's an insurance program, let them deal with it, we're not going to. And some other communities say, you know what, let's go for some concept of freeboard. And so really it's just a question for the committee. And Harry, anything you want to?
Branford already does that.
I think we have 1 foot now, and coastal. I don't think we have anything. I'm not sure about the inland, to tell you the truth.
I
It might be
thought it was
all
everywhere
around.
we had 1 foot above the
Yeah.
FEMA.
Yeah. We may want to consider doing another foot, so that's a possibility.
For coastal, I would strongly support that. I mean, coastal resilience people at Avery Point are recommending to plan for 20 inches in the next 32 years.
Yeah.
And, if you're raising your house, you're doing it for more than the next 10 years.
Right. And the incremental cost of another foot. It's
Right.
more an aesthetic thing than anything else, I think, for the most part. I mean, they're looking kind of crazy net right now with them being all up and down, but eventually they're all gonna have to be
Up or under the water.
Yeah.
Is that a reasonable recommendation, the plan will not make this happen, but it's going to advocate that we look at doing this in the future. 2-foot coastal and 1-foot inland in terms of freeboard. If you're going to raise your house, add a little bit of extra protection in there.
Yeah, is this for raising a house or is this for new construction?
It would be new construction too.
It would be new construction, or it would be if you were doing a substantial renovation to a house. So
More than
the-
50%.
The
And this
rule is
substantial reservation is 50%.
50% of the value.
Building,
of the
50% more.
the building value.
Correct, so I think let's put that, if you're adding a deck on, not a problem. If you were adding a sunroom on, probably not a problem. If you were doing like they show on these HGTV shows where you basically sort of tear everything apart inside and redo it, you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars. At that point in time, there's probably gonna be a requirement to lift.
Right, your mechanicals, everything else will have to come up as well.
Are there any issues with the value of the house in terms of, adding to the cost? Is that going to be a liability for the town by adding to the cost of development for each individual lot? Or is that just part of the building regulations? Because you're making a change to the regulations,
right.
so therefore you're making a change to the cost of development.
Right.
Is
right.
that going to be something that's going to come back to haunt the town in terms of a liability?
Off the cuff, I would say other towns have done this. They have gone to, some of them have gone to 2-foot freeboards, as far as I know. I've not explored, that's probably something that should be explored as part of looking at actually implementing the rule.
Because, I mean, that could be a problem for, from a lawsuit standpoint. Perhaps.
Explain that?
So say, for instance, you buy a house, right?
Yeah.
And then come to the building department and you decide that the building department all of a sudden decides that you have to raise the house above the FEMA level. The FEMA level is 12 feet right now, right?
Well, it depends.
Okay, it fluctuates. Okay, so now the town wants 2 feet above FEMA level. Is there a liability for the town?
We already have one, so we're already making them go. So I don't know if it changes the liability to go from 1 foot to 2 foot.
Just something to consider
Yeah.
as you go forward through this.
I don't think there's any liability to the town for requiring more freeboard.
Okay. Would there be a liability if we don't require any fleet?
That's a legal question I can't answer, but I think the issue is if you knew that sea level rise was coming and sea levels were going to rise, why didn't you require people to raise?
Oh, I agree with you. I just think that there's people that don't.
I understand. I think the issue of freeboard is a sensitive one to people, but I think from a public policy perspective, the plan recommending that we anticipate this by recommending people consider additional freeboard is probably a good public policy for Branford for the future.
My guess is case law is probably thin on this. Right? There's probably not that many cases where this has been challenged.
Yeah. It seems to me that if we're simply recommending that it be considered, there's not a lot of increase. I mean, the question of whether there's.
We don't have any liability.
Right, we don't have any liability. The town doesn't, I mean, the town can adopt the plan, and then it's up to the town to put in place some mechanism for considering it and soliciting public input and things like that. But this is a first step to move it in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be an ordinance change, as far as I understand, as I believe that, so the flood regulations are in an ordinance form.
Can I just ask a question? Do you all have any knowledge or awareness of what Milford is doing? Because they had significant problems with Sandy, and I think they've had to address things, in a more of a crisis mode than other towns may have.
Remember reading the Milford resiliency studies in terms of what they had done and some of their efforts as a result of Sandy, but off the top of my head right now, I don't remember exactly what that was.
I was just curious if they've gone to the 2 feet or if there
I
is
think as Harry points out, more and more communities are.
going to 2 feet.
Yes.
So
The building code was changed, I think it was February of 2016, to require the 1-foot increase.
state building code?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So
We're really just saying 1 foot.
then Branford is really only changing it 1 foot
1
above
foot.
the state.
Right. And above what we currently have.
Now we're again gonna end up with a lot of this, but it's only a foot, so at least it's not gonna look.
The next issue on page 2 had to do, the plan recommends, again, this overall concept of linking open space areas and neighborhoods through a system of trail and greenways. It's kind of a big picture, long-term thing that it's going to be hard to kind of complete this in our lifetime, but I think it's something that we could aspire to and move towards, and I just thought the plan could be enhanced by, again, an affirmation from this group that that is something that we should continue to try to work on, improve, aspire to, et cetera.
Could you consider adding to trails and greenways walkable roadsides? Because a lot of benefit for pedestrians, bicyclists, and safety can be derived just by adding edge lines.
Yes, particularly with the change in the travel lane width.
Yes, so on a state roadway, you can go to 11 feet, but they'll allow 10 feet on a local road. So, you know, if there are more heavily populated or traveled roadways in town, that the speeds are higher, you might want to consider marking a 10-foot travel lane and then leaving the rest for, you know, peds and bikes.
Thank you.
Somebody did approach me and requested that the town consider exactly that, narrowing the road lanes, or at least putting white lines at the end of the road lanes on its local roads, to help in the issues you just described, but also just help drivers who can't see the edge of the road as clearly. It just gives you another indicator of where that is, so.
I know, and especially at night, you know.
Exactly.
The other thing that has been annoying the hell out of me lately, but is probably a really good thing, are those rumble strips they have in the middle of the road.
Yeah.
Stripes, yeah, they're
It
different.
is a low-cost safety improvement.
I think they are good.
They are.
Very good.
They are.
They keep you in your lane, man.
They
'cause
do.
that-
They
But if they had, I
use
mean,
crossovers.
if you made it 10 feet and you had them on both sides, that would keep people in.
So on,
So Phil, are you indicating you're weaving more these days than normal? Is that? We're on TV. Let me remind you, you're on
Keep that
TV.
to myself right now.
on,
Too late.
on non-interstate roads, you don't put rumble strips on the edge because you want that area to be reserved for pedestrians and bicyclists.
But I mean, if
You only put
you,
them up
wouldn't the
with
that rumble stripe
You know?
keep cars out of the pedestrian part of the road?
No, because the rumble stripes only go up the center line.
No, but if you had them on both sides, wouldn't that kind of keep people in their lane more and not in the
It would add a
pedestrian?
lot more problems.
Okay.
So obnoxious for
I'm just-
bicycles.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just curious because I think your point is very well taken, that if we can get these roads more walkable, because we have so many places without sidewalks and bikeable, then that's going a long way toward connecting all these open space areas we have and just, you know, taking care of some of the really dangerous areas that we have.
The next topic here, number 3, is a policy question. The state has a assessment program which encourages the retention of undeveloped land. So if as a property owner, you own land which meets certain criteria, you are eligible for a lower assessment. As a result, you pay lower taxes, and as a result, you're more likely to keep undeveloped land longer. The categories under the state assessment program are farm. So if you are a farmer, then you are eligible for a reduced assessment. If you have forest, and the forest requirement on the state statutes is 25 acres or more, you are eligible for the reduced assessment. And then there's a third category, which is called the open space assessment, but it's a poor word, really. It's really a local option program. And right now, Branford participates in the farm and forest designation, but not the open space or local option designation. And the question is whether or not the POCD should suggest that this be investigated or evaluated. The reason I highlighted this as an issue is that the requirement under the statute is it has to be passed by town meeting, and it has to be recommended in the POCD. So if we don't recommend it, it never goes anywhere. And I'm not quite sure what might play out over the next 10 years. Branford survived to this point without having it. And again, in communities, it can be very useful on parcels which are less than 25 acres in size and gives them a little tax break so they stay undeveloped longer. It's not really open space, it's just undeveloped land, which adds to community character, et cetera. So it's a toss-up question, I would say. On the one hand, we've existed for years without it, and we seem to be doing just fine. And the other side of the equation is that if the plan doesn't suggest it be looked at or evaluated, we basically shut off the discussion for 10 years. So what's the committee's questions or preference on that?
First of all, do we shut off the discussion for 10 years? Because it's my understanding that the POCD can be
True.
amended
Good point.
at any time.
Correct.
So if there really were a groundswell of support for doing this, then the town could amend the POCD, and then the RTM could adopt an ordinance.
That's true.
And I think it's important to keep in mind that the Connecticut's PA 490 type program is relatively weak in that if you are pretty sure you don't have any intention of doing anything with your land for 10 years, you can put it in the program, get your tax rebate, and then pull it out at no cost at the end of 10 years.
Yeah, there's a recapture provision in the first 10 years.
For
but
the
after
first
that,
10
there's
years,
not.
right. There are other other states. I know Maine has a program where the recapture program plateaus at 20% after 10 years. So there's always some recapture, and you always have some incentive to keep the land in the undeveloped state. But in Connecticut, there's no incentive after 10 years.
Are we bound by state statute on that if we were to have our
Probably.
own? Yep. Okay. Yeah, that, I get your, be very,
Yeah, I mean, you know, if the town were to adopt it, I think it would be important to make clear to people that this was not protecting open space the way it would be if the town acquired it or the land trust acquired it.
It's a good point. It's not really an open space strategy, it's more of a community character strategy. By keeping, and in more rural communities, it can be a big issue.
so when you're talking about local option, that just means that the town can make a decision on a piece that doesn't qualify for the other two categories? Is that what it is?
So, for example, I think Madison has a program, and the town of Avon has a program, and the program says that for any parcel which is more than 2 times the minimum lot size, in other words, this is a parcel which could be split or developed with another
Okay,
house in the
yeah.
future, the portion of the parcel which is larger than the minimum lot size is eligible for this exemption.
It's still,
Doesn't apply in commercial or industrial zones.
it's still the option of the landowner,
And the landowner would apply.
land option.
But there are state statutes and criteria for the farm, state statutes and criteria for forest, but the other option, what's called open space, is the local option. You can decide what criteria. Westport, on the other hand, identifies specific parcels. This parcel gets it, that parcel gets it. And it's.
Well, it would have to be truly subdividable, because you could have a parcel that's 2 times the area, and it's not subdividable, you know? So you would have to figure out a criteria that would specifically determine which parcels were subdividable.
So I don't know how many parcels are potentially eligible. There could be a little hit to the tax base on this because the expenditures of the town, for the people who get the tax break, everybody else might pay $1 more. Not sure what it would be. So it's
With what, the way the state statute is, though, to me, it's like, that kind of negates any advantage, you know, to keeping the property open, because, you know, if you're gonna live there for 10 or 20 years and then turn around and subdivide it when you retire and move away, you know, what have we really gained, you know, except losing all those taxes?
We can't hear you over here.
I'm sorry.
I would say that the amount of taxes that are lost is probably negligible, since the town assesses excess land over the minimum lot size at $7,500 an acre. So
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't see any real advantage, or I don't see that there's a huge advantage to even doing it, you know?
So what I've crafted here is that if Branford wants to explore this in the future, then they can amend the POCD to do this. Then the last thing I just wanted to pass on, Bill, for your information, in addition to Maine, Massachusetts actually has what's called the Chapter 61 program, and you have to give the town a right of first refusal if you want to get into the program.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes, very. So just pass that on for your information. Comment number 4. This is a big, under coastal issues, this has been a big discussion that has come up. The issue, in a sense, is should the Flood and Erosion Control Board or another entity be charged as the Coastal Vulnerability Working Group? If I understood our discussions previously correctly, the issue is yes, we should have a Coastal Vulnerability Working Group. Should it be a new group that is formed? The statutes do provide for municipalities to have an entity called a Flood and Erosion Control Group. They do have some statutory authority which could be of use and value to this group. So it would seem to me that this could be one of the major recommendations to come out of the plan, and we could advocate for investigating whether a Flood and Erosion Control Board is the right vehicle to do this. What's the thoughts of the committee?
I think I understand what the Flood and Erosion Control Board has done in the past, which has been pretty technical and really focusing on specific, flooding and erosion. My sense is that there are a number of big issues related to coastal vulnerability that are not specifically flood and erosion. So if the Flood and Erosion Control Board were going to be used, I think it would be important to expand the membership and the expertise on it so that it doesn't just become, just sort of continue on in the way it's been.
I'm not familiar with the Flood and Erosion Control Board and exactly what they do and when they meet and what is that, Harry?
I don't know if I'm the best person
Anybody
to
else?
give you a thumbnail of it. I want to say they meet monthly or as needed. As Bill's mentioning, I think it's very technical.
I
they have
think it's
larger-
as needed.
Yeah, they have a larger role as defined in ordinance and possibly even statute than they really execute. So there's a lot of things they can do. I don't know what the extent of that role is. We would need to explore all of that. And maybe the recommendation could be crafted as a statement that the role of the Flood and Erosion Control Board should be explored as a possible vehicle to constitute also this Coastal Vulnerability Working Group. And that way, if it doesn't really fit completely, then something else could be looked at, but that might be a first place to start.
Another model for doing that might be as an advisory committee to the First Selectman. We've got a model here in town with the Select Committee on Open Space that is, it draws on, the membership specifically draws on a number of different boards and commissions that have some connection to acquisition of open space. So membership includes a couple people from the Land Trust, Planning and Zoning, Inland Wetlands, Parks and Open Space, Conservation Commission, Board of Finance, Economic Development Commission. Now, not all of these positions are filled, but that's what the, I believe there was an ordinance that set it up, and that was, the membership that were.
And that's an advisory?
And it's an advisory committee to the First Selectman, right.
Don't you have to define what it is that you want the role for these folk to do before you really get into the details of, how often they meet in the membership? The vulnerability group sounds like a planning group to me, looking in the future, as opposed to an erosion control, which has got something in hand that they need to deal with, and how those two might mesh. I think you got to define that first before.
I'm not
you
sure
can
they
figure-
are. I'm not sure they are the same group, to be honest with you. I mean,
So I think, I thought we had a good discussion here. I think the idea of a tactical, flood and erosion control sounds like a tactical group, and the coastal vulnerability sounds like a strategic group. So a strategic group, I would prefer, I think, that the plan recommend that this be a ongoing working group rather than reporting to the selectmen. I think the energy task force, Green Energy Task Force has become inactive. While I hate to think that coastal vulnerability issues are going to go away, I also wouldn't want it to be disbanded. So it seemed to me that what I'd like to try to do is recommend that we explore the role and the organization of this group in a way that will serve best and maybe lay out some options. We will not have the ability to make this happen, and planning and zoning, when they adopt a plan, will not have the ability to make this happen. But I do think with the responses we've had so far, there's support in town for making this happen, and exactly what that best approach would be will filter itself out, I think, in short order. Does that sound like a reasonable approach? So I think under question 5, I think we kind of addressed that up as part of question 1 again. So I think we're good there. Unless, is there anything else? We have had conversations about the character of coastal development. What happens in the interim period, if you will, if some houses get raised and some houses stay low, the character of the neighborhood is how to establish design guidelines or requirements in the coastal area? Or we would end up telling individual homeowners to come to us for design review?
Well, I mean, there's some things we don't have currently. We don't have any kind of required setback from tidal wetlands per se. There's recommendations in DEP fact sheets and so forth, but I think we've been doing it on an individual sort of ad hoc basis, the P and Z level. I don't know. Does that sound right, Joe?
I thought you had a 25-foot, isn't there? Is there a 25-foot?
There's a 25-foot, but there's nothing, that's only certain things. You can do still, you don't have a undisturbed area necessarily.
Okay.
You've got
It's just a review area.
it's just well, it's a setback of certain development, so like you can't build within
A
that.
deck off your
Right.
house or something. Okay.
And have an active strip where you're actually filtering runoff, for example, and leaving a vegetated buffer between the resource and any developed area on a property. That might be something to look at.
And as far as the zoning regulations, I mean, there will be height limitations that may have to be changed because we have a
Yep.
pretty squirrely way of measuring the height of the building. The capacity or the ability of a homeowner, the permission to a homeowner to bring in supplemental fill to put at the base of the house if they want to grow something to help mitigate the apparent height of the building. And one of the favorite horses I like to ride about on all this is at some point we've got to open up the zoning regulations to consider a different building type, because we have a building type that has evolved out of the cottage style, and the flood generation is going to create a different building style whether we like it or not. Somehow we want to anticipate that so that we can stay within the sort of traditional concept of what zoning is supposed to do as far as, making correct placement of things on a lot with light and air and, all the stuff that makes good buildings without necessarily being a building code kind of matter.
So it's more aesthetic design considerations, but also development.
We want to leave leave the door open for an aesthetic development, but there is a physical comportment to buildings that will need to occur that's going to be different. And I don't want to start, waving my arms about, all the CNU stuff about how they're going to be different, but we should not be clinging so hard onto our old zoning regulations and looking forward into what we're saying here is going to it implies certain changes and certain differences, and we should be sort of thinking about those and get ready to embrace them.
If I'm hearing you correctly, Joe, it's the changes that we need to make. This is part of it, I think, is the changes that we need to make regarding coastal requirements. One of the things I had thought to mention before and forgot until you just reminded me is, it's like squeezing a balloon. It's, if you're going to make people raise their houses up higher out of the out of the water, you got to let them go higher at the other end too. So there, that's something that needs to be part of this whole thing too, I think. But I don't know if that's, it's a part of, there's a whole lot of things, you're right.
Things that open up, sorry to use that term in this context, but of issues that open up, all of a sudden your view shed is going to start changing from housing behind you, light penetration onto a site. When you have very many small buildings packed close together, that's going to get to be different. So there are a lot of the sort of big planning issues that are there need to be looked at and considered.
Yeah, it's almost like you're compensating those people who live in those areas too for their loss of kind of what they had but I don't know if that gets into the actual zoning requirements.
Well, I think the hard part could be crafting a regulation to deal with this, but another way that we could, we're not the only community grappling with this issue. And maybe what we could do is advocate for the assemblage of a guidebook, which talks about sort of, sensitive design in coastal areas. And the issue is, yes, you have to raise your house. We're sorry you have to raise your house, but there's nice ways to raise your house and not nice ways. And just some simple graphics to kind of show design concepts and features could be a helpful handout. I think given the value of coastal property and the challenges that some of these properties have, people's design choices aren't unlimited. So it may not have any effect, but if people understand, maybe an educational tool could be a way to address that.
All right, I'm just saying, within the jurisdiction of the POCD and its effect on zoning regulations, we just need to anticipate that and start, if not laying the tracks for it, at least surveying our way through the woods where the tracks are going to go.
Excellent point.
Item 6 is something that we had definitively called out for further discussion. This is again the concept of design review of new development and redevelopment. I think specifically we had talked, I think in the booklet, the concept of commercial areas. Should there be a design review component for new development? A design review committee? Separate design review committee? Or some other type of approach?
So this would really be potentially an expansion of the design review process that we already have for the center of town and for now Stony Creek to cover. I mean, certainly we look at some of the stuff that goes on outside of the village district and wish that we could do something about that.
I think for municipal buildings, that would be important.
Yeah.
Those are big projects and,
So the intention would be just to apply it to new commercial development?
Some communities approach this in different ways. So almost no community in Connecticut applies this to single-family residential development. For communities that do apply it, pretty much everybody applies it to new commercial development. The area that sometimes falls in the middle is institutional development, such as municipal facilities, churches, or other large uses. And some communities also apply it to multifamily development because that's sort of a larger institutional project. So I think we should perhaps start with the commercial discussion and decide if we want to move beyond that.
In those communities that adopt this, is this something beyond a typical P&Z function? What's the added value or benefit of this particular forum?
Applicants will often tell you that they don't want to have to go through a design process. For 7 years of my life, I worked for a real estate development company where my job was to get permits and approvals. And whether or not the community had a design review process dictated what we prepared and submitted as part of our application. So CVS has a palette of options And if you don't have design review, then you get the bottom of the pile. If you have design review requirements, then you are going to get closer to the top of the pile. They're going to try to get you the lowest they can to get their approval type of thing. But it really shouldn't sort of just be about that. Since I've had the occasion to work in Branford for 10 to 15 years now, at this point in time, this issue continues to come up, that people, it's the biggest sorry people have about town is the appearance of our commercial corridors. We can't fix this overnight, but if we don't actually address it at any time, we'll never fix it. So the question could be, could we, over time, as part of development and redevelopment, enhance these buildings in some modest way, shape, or form to just make them better than they are? And I think that it might be the operative question in a sense as to, is this important enough to add an additional step into the process? Getting back to your original questions, I think the process works best when it's separate from the planning and zoning process. The reason I say that is planning and zoning has enough on its plate, their meetings are full, and it's hard to focus in on this. I think the process, in my experience, works best when a separate architectural review board will meet with an applicant. It can happen during the daytime, it can happen at a convenient time, if you will, hopefully coordinated with the planning and zoning process, where planning and zoning is then put in the position as being the design review board of appeals. So somebody comes along and design review says, we think that it should have a cupola on it, and it should be gold leaf on the cupola. Well, the applicant would come to you and say, listen, I'm happy to do the cupola, but really gold leaf? I mean, that's crazy. And the commission would say, you know what, you're right. We don't need gold leaf, but cupola's good. So it kind of gives a little creative tension, if you will, and the ability to hopefully negotiate for better design. Maybe it's a good cop, bad cop situation or whatever. So I don't know if this is something that Branford is comfortable thinking about or suggesting or recommending, but I think it's a question that needs to be asked.
Well, Glenn, I think it already really happens in the Town Center Review Board, and I think it works relatively well from my standpoint. So even though you might want the gold leaf from the review standpoint, you can, obviously change that at a certain point. So I think if you look at what's gone on in the center of town, I think that's very important to, because it's cohesive design at this point, or more cohesive than certain areas of Branford. And if you could tailor that to other areas of Branford, I think that would be helpful.
So I think if that process could be, maybe it's a slightly different process. I mean, the resolution in downtown as a pedestrian-oriented area is a little bit different than the automobile-oriented area. But if that
Still,
process could
a
work.
lot of the things still hold true. There's more continuity than discontinuity.
The standards could certainly be different. The standards could certainly be different on a commercial strip than what you necessarily want to look at for the town center. I believe Guilford does this, and they use Madison as well. So it's fairly similar, like you said, to the town center process, where there's referral to a design review body, and recommendations come back to P&Z, and they could accept or reject, as Glenn mentioned.
Kathy?
I just remember from that first night when we had so many people show up, this was a theme that I heard a lot, and I think people they sounded like they wanted to preserve the character, charm, what downtown has. And I think if that can be applied some way, in a fair way, to the commercial development beyond that zone, I think it only benefits us if that's what this would mean.
I think, having been on the review board in the center of town for years, it's a very collaborative effort that happens, and Marcy, you've been there, some of you have been to it. It's, we don't have teeth, with a lot of stuff, but when people do come to us, they mostly come with the idea of, like, is this going to be good for the center of town? And a lot of times people leave with like a completely different plan than they walked in with, just because they don't know, and they haven't maybe hired an architect, or they haven't, or the architect doesn't even know what's going on in the center of town. And once they leave, they usually feel good about what they're doing. That playground was a perfect example. We did some really cool things with that playground behind the church in the center of town that wasn't going to be there originally. It was going to be chain link, and it was going to be a whole lot of stuff, but in the end they left with a nice black fence and the layout was really turned out nicely. So I think that's how that works. So if we could, I don't think it would be that hard to have a that something that covers the commercial. And, I think really right down to excluding single-family homes, I think probably would be all you'd have to exclude, because you may want to do multifamily homes. You may want to do condos and, whatever else gets developed, anything, but certainly I would exclude single-family homes from that.
I would agree.
So now, oftentimes as part of the plan, the verb that we choose sort of gives a sense of the strength of the direction. So the verbs that we could choose here could be explore, establish, implement.
I kind of go for explore, only because I'm sitting here thinking, be careful what you wish for. I mean, good design is like pornography. I know it when I see it, and it's not the same thing to everybody. And
Bad design is pornography sometimes.
and it's having seen recommendations from the town center that have come to us that I found of questionable technical merit. I don't know what they're telling them as far as design. I don't know how anybody is really and truly qualified outside of a design studio to critique a design, and even then, you're in a very, very hermetic situation. And the rules are pretty clear, and everything's pretty limited. I think to the degree that a design review board can be advisory and can be helpful, yeah, it's always useful to talk about what you're working on, and a different set of eyes will find something that you may have missed. You may have a point that you've really understated or misstated in the design. It could be really helpful. But to the extent that you can have sort of one-note pendants pounding on certain issues, you will get the homogeneity of a condo complex, which is always like, I get twitchy when I think about how condo boards tend to rule condominiums and sort of the lack of diversity in any personal expression that you would find in a condominium. So, yes, a design review board can be overruled, but it's just, it's something that in its implementation and its structuring, it needs to be done pretty carefully. I think when we did Stony Creek, that was one of these things that could have gone either way, but we ended up getting a bunch of really good sort of this design kit from Robert Orr that ended up getting a Connecticut Preservation Trust Award. And that's the sort of thing where it's this way, not that way, to give direction.
I think sometimes the design review board can help the applicant or the architect with their applicant to get a little more quality in the product. And, if the applicant felt like the town's on their side as far as promoting the development, but doing it from a quality basis, I think that's where the design review board is a particular benefit. And, and I think it needs to extend not just to the building type, but, through the site and through, the complete streets and things like that. How that board is made up and the professionals and where those lines are drawn, I think that's a little bit of a sticky line
Yeah,
sometimes, as
Personnel
as we
on
went
the
through.
board makes a big difference, for sure.
Well, because sometimes a project has to evolve to get to the thing, and it's, just having that patience to recognize where one's at and what one person's been charged with doing, and then the design board can then come in and say, well, it really needs to end up here, and then you start to work on a different strategy for that.
So getting back to Joe's point, if we use the verb explore, that gives us the ability to think about different options, if you will, as to how this could be done. It's not quite as strong a verb as established, but the idea could be, I mean, maybe the Town Center Revitalization Review Board, which has already got experience with this, it could be renamed and its focus could grow. In other words, they're working, they've got guidelines, and maybe that's the best DNA. Maybe you wouldn't want a separate group. So that could be an exploration. Or maybe the exploration is, well, no, hang on a sec. We need to have one group dealing with this because they actually have, as a village district, some legal oomph. The other group is more of an advisory group, and that can be explored. So we don't have to have a strong verb, but it could be, maybe it's a two-verber, explore and implement. So the idea is
We could
figure it
bump
out
up
and then
to
go.
recommend.
Pardon me, Joe?
We could bump it up to recommend. and
Yeah, I
let
was
them-
thinking recommend.
let them, the details are gonna have to be thought over by
Yep.
others elsewhere.
Good. Anything else on 6? So I think 7, 8, and 9 are issues that we've kind of talked about. They're sort of general. I don't think they rise to the level of some of the other issues here unless somebody wanted to jump on any of those.
No, but just for the sake of continuity, this came up a lot in the transit-oriented development
Yep.
district study. And there are a number of marketable and brandable concepts in Branford. that,
Absolutely, yes.
You know, of considerable economic value to the to the entities that are there, and could help promote things like transit and stuff, expanded transit and stuff that we really need to get a hold of.
And I think the thing that resonated most with me from the TOD study and other things is that I think it really enhances our sense of place in Branford. You know Branford because you live here. You understand how it's organized and how to get to places. People who come in here have no clue. It's not logical in any way, shape, or form. So if we had gateways and wayfinding and other things like that, it actually creates this sense of knowledge and intimacy, which helps us a lot. So I think that we can build on what's in the TOD study and suggest that, and push, if you will, that this actually occur and be undertaken.
Maybe use the word implement.
Well, slow down here.
We need a little scale going across with the words on it.
You started this whole,
Yeah, no, it's,
Can you pull out your verb chart?
we're just speaking in your vernacular.
I'll get you after the meeting.
There is a tentative project and a small pool of money to start looking at wayfinding signage and where it should be and what it should look like and its characteristics. I mean, signage, its size, lettering, pedestrian versus vehicular-oriented signage. So that is something we're probably going to get going on. I mean, I think probably talking about maybe that as a kernel of a larger program that might be a little bit bigger, more enhanced, and so that first step is kind of ready to start probably within the next year.
I guess I see it more integral with the design review committee and, having standards for municipal buildings and complete streets. I see it all as one brand
Yeah.
for the community character, and I think it all needs to weave together.
Yeah.
And, we always do things, it's easy to start with one step with one piece, but I think there needs to be some vehicle, and I don't know what it is, whether it's coming from planning and zoning or the review board, to be conscious of what that character is that we're working for, while not being overly dictatorial with the design, and architecture of it.
I will just say that the concept of a branding program makes me nervous. There's far too much empty branding going on in our commercial world these days, and I would really hate to see something like that happen in Branford. If there's something that grows organically out of the Branford community, that's great.
I agree with you.
But to sort of suggest that there be a branding program,
I saw one community in Connecticut that undertook a branding program, and what came out of it was worse than what they'd had before. but I think Branford has so much going for it that it's just not really kind of packaged well.
That's what I'm, yeah.
And I just think that there's all these opportunities that are kind of passing us by. And when you start thinking about the wonderful history, our historical experience in terms of just settlement here, the historic resources we have, Stony Creek, the quarry, the Thimble Islands, the brewery, the harbor, so many things start to come together that if there was a way to sort of unite these things in people's minds, it has some economic opportunities for us as well. So branding is probably not the right word. So I'll try to figure out a way to characterize this, but certainly empty branding is not what we're really looking for.
But wayfinding, I think, is.
Wayfinding
whether
helps.
it's Signage.
But wayfinding is once you get here. The branding, in a sense, is an
Yeah, the
external.
bigger identity.
Kind of.
It's neighborhood identity and promotion. Before branding was a buzzword, they did that in New Haven. Neighborhood identity and promotion. And all of a sudden, Fairhaven, which nobody really understood what Fairhaven was, became a place. Fairhaven Heights became a place. Beaver Hills was a place. So I agree with Bill. I mean, branding is sort of like, makes me gag saying that word based on how it's, evolved. And because it is such a buzzword of, contemporary usage, neighborhood promotion or neighborhood identity, I think, is probably a more generic term.
So is the purpose of branding, or whatever you want to call it, to promote tourism, or what is the grand scheme of things?
Well, I think that's a piece of it. There's a historical tourism piece, maybe a recreational tourism piece, and some of this is already organically happening. If you go down to the brewery, one of the most prominent things is you go in the entryway into the lower floor is a huge, that 1911 panorama of the center of Branford. And I know the brewery owner is very interested in trying to promote an awareness of the historical context of the location he's sitting in. I mean, you combine that with some of the ideas from the TOD study about recreational use of, Blue Way along the Branford River, and we're talking about this walkway between Indian Neck and South Montaukese. All these things start to become pieces of a bigger picture, and that's what I'm sort of taking out of this. Does that make sense?
I think it's tourism. I think it's marketing, both in terms of real estate, residential real estate values and commercial value, if you will. Branford is an interesting place. And I also think it's sort of a unifying element for the different neighborhoods. I mean, Short Beach and Stony Creek are they're separated by distance and time and a lot of other things. They're sort of opposite ends in a lot of ways. And we're all part of the same community. And so what is Branford?
So,
how do we get that?
So this may not be appropriate for this plan, but in Milford, they wanted to do some kind of thing. They actually established a welcome center in the library. So if you came to town, for information, or I don't remember what the sign says, but you could go there and you could get all this information, which would tell you about the different areas. Then you could follow your wayfinding sign to get to these destinations. In some areas, chambers of commerce have, staffed areas to greet people and promotes the tourism.
Self-guided tour kind of a thing.
Sure.
Digital.
It's a place to bring all the information together so that, people that aren't familiar with the area can come and get it.
Can I just add, from the Economic Development Commission, we are looking at ways to promote Branford. Brand may be a word that folks aren't fond of, but, our identity and all of the assets. So we are getting more involved in that. So maybe, if there's there's efforts underway to promote Branford and all the positives that we have in the Economic Development Commission. Maybe that's where we should work with this marketing focus.
Yep.
Do we have a tourism? What do we have for a tourism group now? Do we have a tourism? We did at one point have some kind of tourism group.
Not the town, the
Not the
chamber
town?
has a committee.
Oh, chamber, I guess I was thinking
And it's
about.
a three-town chamber,
Okay.
so we participate in that. We promote the town center,
Uh-huh.
And that's part of the Discover Branford effort we have. In the past, we've called it a sound location. So we've done this in the past, and I think the challenge is to keep it fresh.
Yeah.
And not to use the word brand.
Well, and the other benefit too is helping visitors find all of the great shops and restaurants and, promote the businesses in town or throughout the different neighborhoods if that's, like Indian Neck or what have you.
I think finding the locations really brings up the need for the interconnectivity of the locations and it's not just the wayfinding, but it's the intermodal connections, whether it be by, boardwalk, greenway, bicycle, car, train, shuttle. That's the piece that I was referring to before, not as necessarily a brand, but as a connective identity to the overall character that I think would raise things up quite a bit and would, in effect, help tourism.
And I think in doing this, it's important the idea of community involvement, identifying communities. It often comes up when you start talking tourism in Stony Creek that you get a pretty negative reaction about how they're already inundated and there's not enough parking and no public restrooms, et cetera, et cetera. So, you don't want to brand something that pulls in a lot of people and makes the neighborhood feel overwhelmed.
Let's move on to item 4E. I think the big question here is there is a plethora of information related to sustainability and resiliency, and I guess the guidance I'm seeking from the committee at this point in time is how detailed do we want to be getting in terms of sustainability issues? Do we want to promote the concept and let it play out over time, or do we want to have specific goals, net zero by 2050, other items like that, request or suggest that the town never buy a fossil-fueled vehicle in the future? How general, I think it's a concept to promote, but the question is to what level of detail?
I had, not surprisingly, some thoughts on this. I would suggest strongly that the POCD strongly support the town adopting the state goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that's 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. And I'll point out the 80% reduction by 2050 is actually in a state statute. It's not binding, but that's something that's right out there. So that basically says we're in line with the state, and we see this as an important thing to do. I think we should recommend reactivating the Clean Energy Task Force, and I know from some conversations that I've had that I believe there is a core of people who would be interested in being involved in that. So that's something that probably would get off the ground pretty quickly.
When did that stop being active?
Shirley, you were on it, weren't you?
Around 2008, 2010. Because it's mandate we had money from the state for public buildings to put on solar panels. The money has since run out, but certainly the concept exists, it just has to be reestablished. There's no ordinance necessary.
We certainly missed the boat with probably the two biggest buildings we're going to work on in the next 10 years. I don't know how that happened, but
I think I agree with Shirley that the Clean Energy Task Force concept, as it was rolled out across the state, started out with a very narrow focus of encouraging residential adoption of. It wasn't even installing renewable energy. It was sort of, signing up for the REC program. So you'd add an extra couple of bucks to your bill that would go towards supporting projects somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't really any particular support, I think, from elsewhere in the administration to kind of,
just with some money available.
It was just there, and that's what they did. And you know, as with many commissions, people serve for a while and then they move on and ran out of steam.
From what I've seen, there are a number of these energy task forces in shoreline towns. I'm more familiar with those, and it's more grassroots, and it's like community involvement and promotion of it, not only renewable, but energy efficiency, and teaching people about the benefits. They have outreach and marketing campaigns. They do light bulb drives to get people, you know, to get rid of their incandescents and learn about LEDs. So that's one point on the task force. But in terms of the building requirements, if a new building is being constructed, do we have certain energy efficiency standards that we have in place, or should that be considered, you know, so much above code, or however it might be worded?
Talking, this is private development, not municipal, right? Or both?
I think it should be both.
Okay.
But
I'm not aware of anything in private section that's not municipal through zoning regulations or anything like that. I'm not even sure we have the authority. Do you know anything more about that?
The building code does have, there is an energy component to the building code, but in terms of zoning,
no, not zoning.
Okay.
Just
Building code.
requirements. When you're building, you need to be X% above code with the building envelope or the mechanicals, or
I'm not familiar with it.
something to push energy efficiency.
There are voluntary programs such as the Green Building Council and others that try to promote LEED, certified, thank you, buildings, if you will. So LEED is, I forget exactly what the acronym is, but the whole concept being to promote and encourage this type of thing, but codes that require it. I have seen discussion documents in other places where they suggest that if you were to make your building more efficient, then maybe you could reduce your parking count. But these types of zoning encouragements are unrelated, if you will, to there is no real cause and effect between a building's energy efficiency and its parking space ratio. So it doesn't it's an encouragement, yes, but it doesn't necessarily make sense from a public policy perspective.
Well, then can we encourage or put some kind of language to say, you know, it would be beneficial to consider, or whatever the correct wording might be, to be more mindful of it?
I think promote. I think the concept of sustainability, I think we can and should promote, encourage more in this area. I don't think we have to get to specific, you know, measurable goals. We can reference, if you will, the state goals in these areas, and again, encourage people to do it. And particularly in public buildings, I think, again.
I just don't think should be wishy-washy about it, because this is probably one of the most important things we're going to be talking about in the next 10 years. And if we don't make a strong stand on this, to me, you know, we're missing the boat.
I think, you know, just to address the middle school and the building committee, the state, in order to give the grant money when the ed spec was put together, has guidelines that do relate to energy sufficiency. Do they go as far as some of the things Bill had suggested? No, because there's a gap between what could be and what the state requires, and there's no place like the POCD that says that these are our goals. So consequently, you know,
Nothing
we were
happened.
behind the 8 ball in trying to implement something like that, and at that point, money had been kind of allocated, and you're too far along down the road.
It's
So-
still surprising to me that with everybody putting solar panels on their houses these days, you can't drive down the street without seeing them be installed, that we didn't even look at that, you know?
I actually, I think Marcy was there. I went to the building committee one meeting just to raise the question about renewables, and I may have been too late.
That's the problem.
I was told that they were incorporating energy efficiency because the state required them to do it in order to get the grant. But they weren't doing anything about renewable energy because it was expensive and they were on a tight budget.
Yeah, but you know what? We're on a tight budget for the next 30 years while they pay for the building too, you know? So, I mean,
So give us the leverage to require.
I think, let me take a shot at this language.
One
Go ahead.
question. Regarding municipal sustainability, do we have a program for changing out the street lighting to LEDs?
I'm not aware of that. Kathy, do you know
Eversource
anything more?
does.
Eversource does? Okay.
Yes.
So you work with municipalities in terms of swapping them out and, you know?
Yes, there's a
the flathead.
schedule, which I don't know offhand, but there's a plan for each municipality that has not decided to purchase the lights and make their own conversion to LED. And there's a schedule, where it's being rolled out across the state. So we are upgrading our entire system to LEDs.
Okay.
So let me take a shot at this. I may not get it exactly right in terms of the verbiage, but I'll take a shot at it, and then we can tweak it as we go, if you will, to the next steps.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
This whole section on sustainability really focuses just on environmental and energy. I didn't know if that's the intent, or are there other areas of sustainability that should be considered, like, community services, affordable housing, safety, encouraging businesses, right? Or are they covered in other areas sufficiently?
Well, using locally sourced materials, for example, I fought hard for that for Walsh Building and was told there was no money.
So this was set up, if you will, for sort of more of an energy, water type of philosophical approach, a being green approach, but I think it does expand out to other parts of the plan. So the question is, do we mention the other parts and cross-reference back here? Do we expand this and make it a theme?
Or just change the title of this to make it more focused just on energy?
But some towns have adopted or are creating a sustainability plan. And I don't know how far-reaching they are, but I'm aware that Clinton is doing this right now. And if there's a way to suggest we ought to be looking at it because it's good for the environment, the whole energy efficiency benefit, it saves people money, but it also reduces significant amount of pollutants for air quality. And
Plus, we could maybe
and
use
reduce
one less
fossil
gas
fuels,
line.
and, there are all sorts of benefits. So I think we ought to be proactive in what we say in the plan to support exploring sustainability and the potential options for Branford.
Yeah, I think if you want to have its focus, it needs to be energy focused as opposed to broadened.
I think so. That's a good point, but I think maybe your suggestion of narrowing or focusing this section on just energy and efficiencies then probably makes more sense.
I have a suggestion. I was sort of mulling over this question after the last meeting where I raised the point about the sections being kind of siloed, and I saw connections in between. I went back and looked at the 2008 plan, and there's a chapter called Context, which talks about the whole demographic situation, flattening population growth, aging population. So looking at trends. Well, sustainability is a trend. It's certainly a trend in terms of the environmental aspect of the consequences of fossil fuel use. But there are other things that, like you said, maybe affordable housing or something that also ties into having a sustainable community. So maybe 2 to 4 pages in the context chapter, just talking about this as a as a very
Holistic.
general issue, an overarching issue that impacts in a number of the different areas, and then the areas can focus on in the development. You can talk about affordable housing and talk about that it's important for sustainability of the community or something like that.
Yeah, and I think we talked about at the last meeting in terms of the changing population demographics long-term, the aging population that we're moving towards, and sustainable resources for community services safety, I think that's, where that might expand.
Yeah, so I think that one of the issues I have teed up for our March meeting is to actually talk about the organization and format of the plan. And I think this issue is an interesting one that Bill brings up, because I think we can set the stage here and talk about what's changed since 2008, and that these themes really roll through. And we actually have almost an index, if you will, that points to the chapters of the plan. So sustainability can relate to housing, it can relate to transportation, it can relate to a lot of things. But set it up as being kind of a thematic element at the beginning, and then deal with it later. So we may adapt or change the format of the plan to tell the story the way that we think it's best, but what Bill suggested is an approach that could work. Looking here at the clock, I'd like to open up all of page 3.
So how did we leave off with the verbs on that?
I've circled promote and do this strongly promote, and I need to get a little more expansive, a little bit more detailed. I'm going to take a shot at it and see what I come up with, and we'll take a look and see if I captured the essence of what the committee thinks and feels on this as we go forward.
Thanks. Good.
I had a couple of thoughts I'd just like to toss out for Glenn's notes, and then we can move on. In terms of doing more, in terms of recommendations related to resiliency, I think it'd be useful if the town had a database of properties that have been damaged by flooding, because that will help us look. And the engineering department probably has this, just a question of different groups knowing that it's there. But one of the things that shoreline communities are struggling with is the question of retreat versus armoring. And if we know where properties are being damaged, it allows it allows you to really talk about that intelligently. And also recommend actively identifying funding sources for compensating retreat when that is the best option. Other towns along the shoreline, West Haven and Madison, made good use of Sandy money to compensate people whose houses had been damaged 2 years running by the hurricanes and just wanted to get bought out. And then finally, under C, meeting comments, should the plan include maps of areas subject to potential inundation? I think it would be interesting to have a map, and maybe this would go in the context chapter, that would show a map of the town showing areas that were flooded in Sandy and Irene, and those two storms were pretty much identical in terms of the areas that were flooded. It got up to about the same elevation.
Yeah.
And then to take the 20 inches that we're being told we should plan for by 2050 and sort of, just add 20 inches to that elevation and draw a line saying that
The challenge is this: there are two factors at play here. Number one is, maybe even three factors. We have the base sea level rise, and different projections on that. We do have tidal fluctuations, sorry about that. And we also have storm events. So this is the coastal resilience study that was done for Branford with Mylona McBroom and others, and it actually shows color coding in here of areas, 2020s daily, 2050s, 2080s daily, and then 2020s and 2080s under Category 2 storm condition as areas which are at risk. It's an aerial photo backdrop. You really can't sort of see property lines or anything else. You don't really know, but it gives you a sense of what the sort of risks are. And so that the challenge that some communities are grappling with here is that we recognize the risk. There's a lot of different scenarios in here. There's similar information that's available. The Nature Conservancy created a site called coastalresilience.org, which allows you to go in and sliders on the screen and play around with them and say, well, I'm safe except for a 2080 Category 3. So everything else other than I'm good. So the question, in a sense, is from a public policy perspective, do we roll with the map, not roll with the map? Thoughts?
Well, I remember talking about the resiliency group that's part of Yukon at Avery Point, and I don't know if they have something that explains this situation, a graphic or a way to identify what those additional levels would look like, but I think there are resources out there that we could explore to help explain the situation better.
I know people there, I might be able to find out about what they have.
Okay.
Some people aren't map savvy, maps scare them, and so the map isn't perhaps the best way to do this. But even if there was sort of a profile or something else, I found something for that I think the Hamptons on Long Island had been looking at in terms of sea level rise and some other things, but to help people visualize the issues and challenges that we face. So I think if there's anything, I'll take a look, see what I can find, and I think, Bill, if you can see anything, or if you see anything, just
Something that
let me
would
know.
give, because you're right, an aerial map is flat. You don't really get a sense of, you see how far in flooding goes, but you don't see the magnitude of it, so you almost need a cross-section type.
And even that for some people, because they don't get that. So I think, if you think about the cattle crossing under the railroad tracks right downtown, and you start thinking about, what does it mean in terms of the height of the railroad tracks?
Yeah.
That's some people say, you know what, I get that. But again, the scenarios here, there's so many provisos and other things that go along with this. Well, let me see what I can find.
Even just the 20-inch elevation
Simplistic.
issues that, that impact on roads, and people's driveways are here, and the roads are going to be up here, is that what this means?
Yep.
Isn't the bigger issue is, what role do we feel the town needs to take in educating its constituents, its public, all right, as to the dangers of coastal flooding and in potential impacts, infrastructure changes, et cetera? And how much do you want to provide in terms of education for that purpose? And then decide how much of that you want to do with maps or other vehicles. But the real question is, what's the education role, or what's the responsibility that the town has?
And I think a lot of this is for the Coastal Resiliency Working Group to kind of figure out.
Exactly.
Because I think that one of the things we suggested as part of the booklet here was this concept of triage. There are certain areas that we cannot stop the water. It's just, there's too much, it's too big, or whatever. But there's also areas in terms of public policy where we need to say the town will take on these responsibilities. We will make sure the following happens. There's going to be other situations that on an individual property owner site, you're going to have to figure this out on your own. Whether it's through flood insurance, or I think Joe had pointed to the concept of raising earth either for protection or for aesthetics or whatever. Those are issues you're going to have to get permits for, and you're going to have to deal with those things on your own. So just, if we can start the dialogue today to say to property owners in areas which may be at risk, you take care of this, town will take care of that, and there's some of this other stuff we're just not quite sure yet. But this is what the Coastal Resiliency Working Group needs to start figuring out, as to what point in time we stop maintaining a road. We're not going to maintain it for one house. We're not going to do that. At that point in time, it basically becomes a driveway. It's your driveway, knock yourself out. Those are hard choices, but we need to start thinking about those. And so I hate to kick the can to another group, but I think it's complicated enough that that's something that we need to do.
But I think the maps are important because just, from a planning and zoning perspective, when you get an application, the commission needs something to refer to know that it's in a difficult area or not, or it's in an area that doesn't have access.
There's not, but I think the maps that were done for the coastal resiliency study had a lot of thought that went into them. So I think that this was work done for the town. I think it was excellent work, and I think we should at least include that and reference it so people can go find more information. Because there are specific road issues identified. This road or crossing is going to be an issue. So it can, if people are interested, they can.
Just in terms of what you use as a base map, I think that aerial photo layers are not good because they tend to be dark, because we have a lot of green in town, and you can't really pick things out. A parcel map, a white parcel map with boundary lines, maybe, or maybe just roads, is much more, allows to better visualize what it is you're trying to show.
And then you can overlay colors on top of that.
You can do that, but I mean,
but
none of the maps that we had in the 28 POCD were over aerial photos. And there was a reason for that, because we wanted to be able to highlight differences
Sure.
that would have been obscured if you tried to overlay it on.
Yeah, so let's work with Harry. We'll get back in touch with the consultant who prepared that work. It's a GIS data layer, presumably. So let me see what they got. If we can get it, we can remap
all you
it,
have to
and
do is
we're on our way.
flip the map switch from.
Because I think at some point in time, it makes sense either for us or the Coastal Resiliency Working Group to do that.
Right.
So we'll start that ball going. On page 3, I don't think we have time to go through all of the issues here. I think the key issue here, in a sense, relates to question 22. Can we start with that one and then revisit any others on here? I know, jump to the big one right off the bat.
Yesterday in the news, the governor came out, he wants to rewrite the statutes governing affordable housing.
What did he say?
The carrot approach wasn't working, wants to use a stick to beat it at you.
So require people to be at least 10% or more?
That's kind of the gist of what they were going towards, but yeah, he had, it was in the news yesterday, that today's paper, how he wants to rewrite, put it down here.
Yeah,
Rewrite statutes governing the zoning laws to require.
So right now, the governor submitted a bill, which changes Section 8-2 of the Connecticut General Statutes. 8-2 is the statute that basically gives a municipality the power to zone. Says you can zone under the following rules and conditions. There's a couple of significant modifications to that act that the governor has proposed. Number one is the zoning has to be used to affirmatively create affordable housing. And the Department of Housing will establish a review criteria for municipalities that do not, in their zoning regulations, promote the creation of housing choice and housing options. And if they decide that the municipality does not, they become ineligible for state discretionary funding. So there's no criteria as to what it is that makes you comply or not comply. But the issue is state discretionary funding.
Have they changed the guidelines yet that, only deed restricted housing counts as opposed to other types that are consistent with it? Because I think that's, I think it's a little misrepresentative of where we're at to say we're only at 3% when I think that we're much more diverse than that. And, and I do feel very strongly that, affordable housing should be part of projects as a percent, and spread out and connected with public transportation, and not, as this stick approach where you try to overfill one location and increase the density, because I think then it just creates too much discord that way.
I agree about sort of the importance of public transportation, but I think the reality is that in Branford, the areas that are available for developing new housing are pretty much distant from public transportation corridors.
So how do we connect them? How do you,
So I think the requirement to provide affordable housing, if you do it across the board and everybody has to do it, that's sort of one approach. If you start putting locational requirements on that affordable housing can only be done within a certain distance, if you will, of a train station or whatever, it can have a chilling effect on that, any sort of development or other development, because some developments just don't pencil out that it makes economic sense in that circumstance or situation. And if you're providing for affordable housing and you're requiring something, then they'll go from 10% to 30%, and they don't have to pay any attention to your zoning anyway. So it becomes a challenge, I think, for municipalities. I think years ago, the state used to fund affordable housing developments. They would just build them around the state. That's what happened. So in 1989, they adopted this act that they essentially realized they couldn't fund it anymore at the need that was generated, so they were going to privatize it. They did. And now this became what became known as 830G of the General Statutes. I think The only way to get exemption right now from the law, because most municipalities are not happy to be under the law, is number one, to get to 10%. And I think the statistic that we came up with in the booklet was almost all of our, or a large percentage of our remaining development potential would all have to be affordable housing for us to get to the, and that's just not going to
We're
happen.
deed restricted.
The other way to do it is a series of rolling four-year moratoriums by producing housing unit equivalent points, and that's also very hard to do because it's based on the number of existing units in town. And I wish there was a third option that the state would give municipalities, which is Branford figures out how to deed restrict the units it has, which are already affordable, and then we get credit for them, and then we get a moratorium as a result of that. But that's not an option that's available to us today. So the laws don't help us get to that moratorium. But the state is undertaking a study. There's an RFP out right now from the state to undertake a statewide housing needs assessment, which may or may not identify for a community like Branford what our target should be. But there's also no benefit, if you will, that comes from us attaining that target or anything else. So,
Avoiding, with that new initiative, it's not so much achieving something, it's also avoiding negative consequences of not doing anything, or not doing as much as needs to be done.
Well, there's also a human need, because as the studies we've already heard, we're aging, and if we want to be able to stay in Branford, I probably won't live in the house that I'm in. I'd probably have to move to some kind of apartment. But what could I afford in Branford? As people, and a lot of the affordability discussion is really not just for, it's all inclusive. It could be any of us that can't afford to live in Branford at some point. And we live longer, and, is it important to us to care about that? I think it is. And it's also affordability for many people who, work in our restaurants or our service industry or any of the minimum wage jobs. It's in some cases people in education, teachers or support staff there. They can't afford a house or a $2,000 apartment rent, and it's, so I'm kind of looking at it from more the human side and having a capacity to help people for the long term.
so I'm trying to think how to convert that to language, though, for the POCD. I mean, it's hard for us to commit to a specific number.
Right.
Should our goal be to meet needs of the community and as a residents? Should our goal be to get a moratorium as soon as we can? Both? Neither? What should we aspire or commit to in terms of?
Well, I think getting to the moratorium just sort of puts us on an equal playing field as far as numbers. It doesn't address the need. I mean, the need is always going to exceed the numbers. So I see those as two very different things. I just, I speak of the moratorium because I want to be on an equal playing field with other communities, because I think we're doing better than other communities in that regard. That's not to say that I don't think we shouldn't do more to create elderly housing in the community or market rate housing that's affordable or things like that, because there is a need, and I think the zoning should support that as well. But I just don't think that the way the government has it set up under this privatized system is really, I don't want to say fair, but clear between, it doesn't clearly tell the story between towns.
Do we want to say anything about the fact that a pretty large number of what I think are probably reasonably affordable housing situations, speaking of the mobile home parks, are actually in business or industrial zones and sitting there just until somebody finds something that they can do with the property that will be more profitable for the landowner.
Right.
Well, those industrial zones are also on the bus line, so I'm
I know,
almost apt to
exactly.
say, why don't we develop a, more substantial affordable situation in locations like that?
Well, I
as a-
think the
a
issue
zoning-
is the preservation of that. So the challenge we sometimes have with mobile home parks, I'm not familiar with the unique or exact situations we have here in Branford, is that the occupant owns the unit or rents the unit, but the land is owned by somebody else. So as a
Yes.
result, there's a rental in place, or there's no deeded right to the property, and so it could be potentially converted. So if the underlying land is zoned residential or business or industrial, there is the potential that leases are not renewed or other situations happen, the land is at risk. If, on the other hand, it's rezoned to mobile home, now there's some level of zoning control. It doesn't stop the redevelopment from happening, because somebody can redevelop it, right? And knowing that it's being rezoned may cause people to act out in other ways, I'm not sure. But these are some of the issues we grapple with in terms of trying to protect the housing stock and choices that we have available.
We don't have any zoning that allows for a new mobile home park to be developed in Branford, right?
I don't believe we do, Rich, do, no. Glenn, maybe you could talk about, there was a recommendation in 2008 plan, I don't think it was ever implemented, regarding creating essentially a fund. So it'd be a payment in lieu of, so if you required something under zoning like inclusionary affordable housing, and it didn't make sense for whatever, lack of transportation and so forth, particular situation, then a development could, instead of actually creating the affordable housing on site, pay into a fund that could be used, I would imagine, in a variety of situations or ways to foster affordable housing in other locations. I don't know whether one of those could be offering a mobile home park landowner some money to put a deed restriction on their property for a certain, like, time or whatever, to maintain it as a mobile home park. So at least that would protect what we have as affordable housing. Is that something that you think might work?
But those mobile homes aren't counted as affordable housing.
No, I'm not talking
Oh.
about the numbers, I'm just talking about actual affordable housing. I'm not talking about meeting the 10% or anything like that.
I would say convert the mobile home parks
Well, I
to
mean-
a deed-restricted building.
Yeah, I don't know
that
if you
would
can, if we can create
get
a
more
deed
units in.
restriction, for example, does that count towards the 10% or not?
I know that Milford got the statute changed last year in a specific way that allowed a mobile home park in their community to be counted.
Right.
So it was widely criticized around the state as being sort of a cherry-picking situation by local legislators, but there is some categorization in the statute that allows for that.
But if we're concerned about mobile home parks changing from residential zones to something that's industrial,
Right.
can't we do something with the zoning to allow future development, but in a residential fashion because of it?
You could rezone it to residential,
Or
but that
Or-
that just might,
or something that's a,
Well, I mean, the zone is industrial for a reason too, so there's a balancing act here
Mm.
between promoting economic development and where should the affordable housing be? I mean, some of these mobile home parks might not be in, I mean, the site, if it's, might be more beneficial to the community as industrial, some kind of development. It might be a situationally specific circumstance, you know what I mean?
yeah.
And, I mean, you certainly want to replace that affordable housing somewhere else, but should you make a giant effort to maintain it right at that specific location? I don't know. I think it would depend on the situation.
Well, or you don't displace it without giving it a place to go.
Yeah.
the statutes do contain a provision which allows the municipality to do almost anything with zoning to promote affordable housing. So Connecticut General Statute 8-2I is very short language, if you will, on inclusionary zoning. As Harry points out, there is a municipality in Connecticut that used that statute to establish a zoning permit fee for any new construction. And through this, as a result of development activity that's occurred, they probably did this 10 years, more than 10 years ago, actually. They accumulated enough money to provide seed money for redevelopment of their housing authority development in town. and doubled the number of units and updated them from 1950s, really sort of, they weren't well configured for the needs of today to build a new project. So there can be ways that this is done. It's a lower Fairfield County municipality, so there's not too many people are complaining, if you will, about this additional fee. The building permit fees and other things are already kind of crazy. But they were able to generate more than $500,000 for this. So there aren't too many communities that do that. The concept, as Harry points out, a fee in lieu of affordable housing is that you could adopt a standard across the board and say any housing that gets built in town has to make provision for affordable housing. And either you build the unit on your site, elsewhere in town, or you make a payment, a fee in lieu of. Now, people can be upset. They say, well, that's the economics of my development. What are you doing? But why aren't you taxing everybody in town for this? Why is it just new development that's, being charged this? So these are the challenges that you would get into, or the criticisms that you would get into, but it's also, again, a way to start to tackle this particular issue. By saying all new development is going to make some provision for affordable housing in some way, shape, or form. And yes, the municipality has an obligation, and we'll do what we can, if you will, to retrofit.
Would that be tiered just for multifamily, or?
Some communities have, and some communities have said no. It's an up across, the municipality I was talking about does it across the board. Any zoning permit. You can come in for a zoning permit for a fence, you're paying into the Affordable Housing Fund. Anything on a zoning permit. I'm with you.
Well, I saw something on the news, and I don't know I think it was California. It might, because it's so expensive to live there and they can't get teachers and folks to work in hospitals because they can't afford to live there and they're commuting 3 hours or something. Some cities have built affordable housing right next to a school.
For teachers.
Yeah. And so they're doing very creative things because the market has forced this to happen. They can't get people to do the jobs that are needed, and they have addressed it by providing the housing. So I don't know, maybe we can explore other models and learn, best practices and develop future plans with those things in mind.
I think too, we need to get a little crisper concept of affordable housing. It's sort of like sustainability. You say sustainability and it's all puppies and kittens. You say affordable housing and you'll get people's backup, and the torches and pitchforks will come out faster than you even knew they could. And I'm not sure, to what end or the actual mechanism we want to have in something like the POCD, because at this point you're getting into really tactical kind of problems, trying to determine, AMI, percentages of AMI for affordability and, the kinds of target groups. But a few years ago, the Department of Housing changed their funding strategy, and they no longer were interested in funding for-purpose housing. In other words, you could not have elderly dedicated facilities anymore. They had to include everybody. And that ended up being a significant problem for the housing authority here, because it started off as a dedicated elderly housing facility. Department of Housing changes its rules, and the only way you can get a LIHTC deal on the job is to go through with a full or full age spectrum allowance in there. And given the range and the structure of the funding arrangements available now, and I would hate to pin a 10-year aspiration of a POCD on that level of mutability, But if you do have a development of sufficient density where you could conceivably have its own convenience commercial, it could be something that we could get an interest in the Connecticut Transit to maybe push the bus line over a street and have them stop by so that you would have that accessibility to the rest of town. So the concept of affordable housing, at least in terms of new development, needs to be considered in terms of mixed housing, but a critical mass kind of concept in order to get the suitable resources made available to it. And I'm not sure how to make that as a statement in here in terms of affordable housing, because we are talking at different times. First of all, we don't really have a good quantification of the problem. The Housing Authority started this a couple of years ago with a feasibility study that was not really perfectly executed in terms of the demographics. But it is really clear that income potential is leveling to going down while age is going up. And if the magic of the market suddenly becomes less magical and a lot of 401ks start to tank, it's going to get a lot worse. I mean, we've seen a lot of companies that have pulled out of retirement accounts. Remington's going bankrupt. I'm sure their fiduciary trusts are going to be standing behind all their retirement accounts real well. But the sort of guaranteed golden years income is really shaky. It's much more shaky than I think a lot of people realize based on stuff I've been reading. And we have both a demographic problem, but we also need new blood and new people to come into town. And when I was on the fire company, it was remarkable the number of guys who were trying to find an apartment that they could afford, be able to bring their kid on the weekends, because a lot of them were divorced, and be able to be close enough to service the, making for calls. And these are guys who are like, doing running tow trucks, had 2 or 3 like really crummy jobs to make sort of minimum wage because they had career aspirations, and they just really wanted to get that call volume in. I mean, the range of people that fall into the needing affordable housing and affordable housing for more than just sort of like one of these Japanese shoe boxes that you stack up in Tokyo is much greater than I think we realize. But we don't have the problem accurately quantified at this point for the age range and the income range. And I don't think we have a comprehensive idea of the opportunities for residential development, because that was really changed just dramatically over a couple of years since we did the feasibility study.
Well, I know from quantifying the need, the Alice report from the United Way there's been a lot of study around, in our communities are all identified with certain poverty levels. I think Branford was, I don't know if it was the federal poverty level, but it was something like 29% of the population. And I think that's probably, to your point, it's probably going to grow over time, or people are going to leave. And that gets back to the whole economic issue of having employees for the jobs that we have and keeping employers here. And that's all related to tax base and, not pricing people out of Branford. So the Alice report has a lot of good information on who those people are, what their income is, and they've mapped, I think probably the whole state or the regions, like the counties, as to how many people fit into those levels right now. And I don't know if they do forecasting for the future, but, I mean, there are other groups that are probably looking at that. And then there's an affordable housing committee or commission. There's a state-level group that I've heard a presentation from. It was very eye-opening in terms of the whole issue and what it means and how certain communities are addressing it. So this is all, just discussion at this point, but maybe, is it appropriate to put anything in here to research or better understand,
I think, yes. I mean, I think that as the background demographics and other things change, this issue is going to change, as Joe points out, the demand, the need. So we always need to continue to explore and educate. I think that the POCD should contain affirmative statements, if you will, about our desire to address the housing needs in the community. And how specific to get.
Well, I think you're saying you don't want to get super prescriptive, but I think, don't we have a responsibility to at least be mindful of this and plan for the future and all of the things that will touch?
I think there's two main housing needs for Branford to be considering in the future. Number one is the growth in the older population.
Yes.
And their housing needs are changing. These are people who want to live, maybe they've lived their whole life in Branford, but where are they going to be in the future? They want to be near their friends, their community, et cetera.
Their children.
And they may find a situation where they would like to rent and they can't find anything.
Yes.
So housing for an older population with different needs, because they're living longer, elevators, et cetera. Then the second one is housing which is more affordable. So there are many people on the housing ladder, the housing spectrum, if you will. And so some people jump a couple of steps or whatever, but in life you sort of tend to go up the ladder, and at some point in time you might come back down a couple of steps. So having steps on the housing ladder at affordable prices for people is another consideration. So I think the plan can and should be aspirational in both of those areas. The free market's going to take care of itself. People who can afford housing at market prices even they probably wish it was more affordable, but sellers always want it to be more expensive. So we find the market price. But the issue ends up being, for social and economic growth of the community, having a diverse housing supply. So being aspirational, I think, is something we should shoot for.
Harry, I just have one quick question, just on that same subject. I know the state has regulations that people can use if they want to build affordable housing in town that can supersede town.
830G.
Yeah. Would it make sense for us to look at our own regulations that would offer some of those same benefits to a developer, where we control it a little bit more?
Well, we have some provisions already. We have an incentive housing zone. It's basically a floating zone in essence, which means it's a provision in the regulations, and you can, through a zoning map amendment process, land it, if you will, on a property. So there's a site at Summit Place out on West Main Street that has just been converted. It's two former commercial buildings, and I can't remember the numbers of I think I want to say about 30-something units, and this percent, I think it's 30%, will be affordable. And that's a program that was sort of put in place and set up in terms of parameters by the state. Branford's not part of the state model. We did essentially take our program and almost mirror what was required to participate in the state program. So that provision's in there. There's a couple of other sections of the regulations that have not been used since I've been here. I don't think they've been well used historically.
Yeah, I think there was one for affordable housing that was put together, detached, I think, by Robinson and Cole, as a matter of fact. We may have taken that out of the regulations. I don't think it's ever been used. But.
Yeah. Well, but I think there are other provisions we could look at putting in the regulations, things we talked about, the fee in lieu and so forth, in addition to all the other sort of larger issues. But certainly there's things we should look at and could look at.
Okay. I think we're...
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we're not going to finish the booklet. I think I'd like to reserve a couple of minutes, if you will, for next steps in the process, but do you want to limit an opportunity here for public input, or do we run out of time, or what's the committee's thought?
I can stay for a couple minutes. I don't know if anybody, is there anyone here who has a comment they'd like to make from the public at this point?
I don't think you've got to the part of, I think got to the part that I wanted to speak on.
Okay.
Which was fun.
Well, we're going to do this, I think, with all of our meetings going forward, where we're going to have an opportunity for public input at the end of the meetings.
And you can always submit something in writing. I mean, if
Right.
you wanted to come to a meeting and, speak and be heard, I mean, the written process is very helpful to us to have more of the background of what you're recommending or what you feel we need to look at.
And that does get distributed to all of us so that we get a chance to read it ahead of time, too.
So I think my goal for the next meeting, members of the committee, is essentially as follows. What I'd like to try to do is, the next meeting, continue our discussion, finish up this booklet. I'm going to prepare 2 other booklets for you, the first of which is on concepts about plan implementation, to get your thoughts or feedback as to how we can try to promote, if you will, implementation of the recommendations that we come up with, and also a brief summary of different plan format issues, just to kind of think about what this document, how long it might be, what it might look like. I'll bring some examples for us. I would like to, we're closing the online survey on Monday. Because of the press release that got published, I got a little spike in responses, so I will bring, send out to you before the meeting the survey results, so you'll get a chance to see online. We have, as part of our budget, carried an allowance for a telephone survey. We split it with the TOD people, so it's 250 surveys, but I will have the survey questions ready for March, and I'd like for you to authorize those survey questions. You'll see those before the meeting. I prefer that those not get published, if you will, because I want people to react to the questions when they get them, but we'll talk about that. The last thing I'd like your permission to do, if I can, is that I would like to understand your interest in responding within our group to a little online survey. In the booklets right now, there are strategies in each of these booklets. So for example, I just grabbed one right here, which is coastal issues. The strategies which are in here are, well, maybe wasn't a good one. Protect coastal resources, maintain enhanced coastal access, establish a framework for addressing sea level rise. And all of the other booklets have strategies in them. I'm interested in your priorities of all of these recommendations in the plan. So what I'd like to do is give you an online link to SurveyMonkey where you would click on the link, and you can do it on your phone or at a computer or whatever, and say, I think this is a number 1 priority. I think that's a number 2. This is a number 3. And what I'd probably do is harass you a little bit over the next week or 10 days or so, because I'd like to get this information back and then bring it back to the committee at the meeting to say, this is how we kind of think the strategies and the plan are playing out in terms of importance. How does this feel? Because following the March meeting, I would like to get actually into drafting, and by having the survey results and your sense of priorities and your feedback on this, I think I got a pretty good framework for working ahead. Would that survey be of interest to you to participate in?
Sure. Yes.
So
Is that different from the townwide survey?
Yes, this will be just about these specific strategies, and you might say, this one is really, really important to me, and this other one, I don't care about that, or it's you care, but it's just a lower priority. So it's going to be a forced choice, is that you only get a certain number of number 1 priorities. That's it. You can't get more.
It's like our dollars. We got to spend money again.
That's one way to look at it.
But how does this impact where we go?
It could, I don't know until I see the results, because what it could do is it could cause us to reorganize the plan in different ways, because the issues of sustainability, for example, we may realize that there's a symmetry, if you will, it pulls all of that together, so we're going to get away from the silos. Or within each of the individual chapters, we're going to reorganize and say, look, this is a big priority. I did a similar type of exercise in another municipality, and they presented this as a separate element of the plan, and they said sometimes we can have conflicts in our strategies. Yes, we want to promote economic development, and we also want to promote design review. And so, sometimes they don't always play nice with each other. People say, I'm trying to do what the plan says, but other people say, but you're not doing this. Which of those has a little bit more importance, if you will?
And the public's input is factored in as well?
As the plan comes to fruition, it will, but based on what you've heard and seen, I'm interested in what your thoughts are as a basic premise, if you will, for these different strategies, which are more important. So not the final be-all and end-all.
When will we have the survey results, if you're closing the survey?
A week before March,
The online survey?
I'll have the results. Yeah, I mean, I'd have to think about.
No, wait, well, I guess my question is, when will we plan to discuss those? The next meeting
March
or the
14th.
following?
March
Okay.
Is it okay if I prepare that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you very much. I don't have anything else, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Oh,
Glenn, just one question. Will we start at 6:00 the next time or no? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Or you're gonna
Save the bid, okay?
I'm sorry?
he's asking.
He wants to know if we're
He
gonna
wants to
finish.
talk about
Oh, we
6A.
skipped.
No, we're gonna start at the beginning and the end. I think it's fair that we do that, start at 6A next time, and then we can roll back through
Yeah,
anything else if we
right,
need
right.
to. Is that, I'm
Well,
thinking,
maybe 5B, we skipped 5B, so do 5B and 6, well, 6.
You
We jumped
skipped
the
all
question.
five except D.
okay.
Yeah,
You went straight down to affordable
so
housing.
5 and 6.
Yeah. Okay.
So you can come a few minutes later. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, we have one more.
Yeah, we got it.
Peter? Yep. Yeah, we can put it on the, I'll put it on the website, so it'll be accessible where you see the booklets. Sure.
And I'd just like to say, I'm not going to be here for the next meeting, and I have a lot of thoughts on the infrastructure-related topics, so I'm going to write those up and distribute them to the committee members. So-
Yeah, I won't be here at the next meeting either, so.
Yeah. So am I it?
Yes.
You're it.
You're it.
Okay.
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Meeting's adjourned.
Jumpstart.com.
The preceding program was brought to you through the support of the Town of Branford. Watch town meetings or other videos on demand at BranfordTV.org.